Cuba is facing an agonizing material reality. The national grid is deteriorating, and severe fuel shortages cause rolling blackouts lasting over 24 hours. Basic logistics are immobilized. People are waiting in massive lines just to secure enough fuel for transport, bringing economic movement to a crawl. The government is responding with a package of economic reforms, opening banking to private capital, authorizing large private employers, and expanding direct foreign trade. Many defenders of these policies classify them as necessary socialist adaptation. They argue that because the Communist Party remains in political control, the class character of these market mechanisms is neutralized. This logic treats the ruling party as an administrative shield, assuming political authority allows experimenting with private banking without altering the socialist state. But when private owners acquire control over credit and hard currency, the state's economic foundation fragments. These reforms represent structural concessions to capitalist relations that shift power away from public planning and toward private nodes of accumulation. To understand the impact, we must examine the historical equivalencies used to justify these reforms and apply Marxist value theory to their structure. Economic power generates political leverage. A business license carries no magical socialist properties simply because it features a red stamp of approval. The official reform package permits private firms employing over 100 workers, allows foreign investment in state enterprises, and the sale of state property to private buyers. A critical component of this package is the abolition of the requirement for foreign investors to work through a state-owned partner. In a planned economy, a state partner provides representation in management, access to company accounts, and a share of the profits. This intermediary enforces requirements for domestic procurement and technology transfer. This shift extends into the financial sector, where banking is being opened to private and foreign capital. Banks act as the central nervous system of resource allocation, determining which enterprises receive credit. Private banking operates on immediate monetary return. Funds are redirected toward luxury real estate and tourism, abandoning national development plans. Surrendering banking and foreign exchange oversight fragments economic control, placing strategic institutions under the influence of private profit rather than social need. Defenders of these policies often invoke Vladimir Lenin's new economic policy as a historical precedent for market reforms. While the NEP permitted small-scale enterprise as a tactical retreat, Lenin explicitly fought to retain the state's grip on the most critical sectors of the economy. Under the NEP, the Soviet state retained control over the banks, large-scale industry, and the monopoly of foreign trade. Cuba's present package weakens these specific safeguards by opening banking and allowing private businesses to conduct foreign trade directly. The second historical comparison frequently drawn is Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up in China. China's 1986 Foreign Capital Enterprise Law allowed for wholly foreign-owned businesses, but these early foreign capital enterprises faced significant constraints. They were subject to rigorous foreign exchange regulation and sectoral restrictions, and they were required to operate exclusively through Chinese or state-designated banks. China implemented these carefully screened experiments from a position of growing internal strength. Cuba is implementing multiple liberalizations simultaneously while facing an acute blockade that weakens its negotiating position. Using Lenin or Deng as an ideological justification while discarding the central safeguards that defined their policies is historical revisionism. To understand the class character of these changes, we must examine foundational Marxist theory regarding value and surplus. A common misunderstanding suggests that capitalism exists whenever a worker is paid less than the total value of their labor. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx rejected the idea that workers receive the undiminished proceeds of their labor under socialism. Every society needs a surplus to replace machinery, build infrastructure, and maintain services. The distinction lies in who controls it. Under socialism, it is socially appropriated. Under capitalism, it is siphoned off for private accumulation. In the context of the Cuban banking reform, private banks and foreign investors extract this surplus and transfer profits abroad, transitioning it into capitalist exploitation. An increase in productive capacity is meaningless to socialist development if the new surplus is privately appropriated and legally disconnected from the national plan. The primary defense for these reforms is the claim that Cuba is enduring an economic siege that makes these measures an unavoidable necessity. The U.S. blockade is a criminal reality. Cuba urgently needs capital, technology, and energy to maintain its infrastructure and feed its population. We must compare the current crisis to the rupture of the early 1990s, known as the Special Period. During that era, Cuba's primary economic partner and energy supplier disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Between 1989 and 1993, Cuban GDP fell by 33%, while imports dropped by 75%. Cuba survived the 1990s without legalizing private banks or direct foreign ownership of state assets, despite the sudden loss of its primary trading bloc. Geopolitically, Cuba maintains relationships today with major economic powers like China, Russia, and Vietnam, unlike the isolation it faced during the unipolar 90s. A blockade forces a state to make retreats, but under siege explains the circumstances. It is not a justification for every capitalist policy adopted. By removing state intermediaries and banking monopolies, the state facilitates a material alliance between international capital and an emerging domestic capitalist class. This alliance creates an enclave economy, visualized as two separate economic loops. Profitable sectors connected to tourism and dollar markets develop separately from the peso-based public economy, hoarding resources and capital. Investment follows private purchasing power, pouring into luxury property, while public services like electricity, transport, and basic food production remain starved of resources. Once these private interests become entrenched, they generate the political leverage to demand lower taxation and weaker capital controls, making the reforms difficult to reverse. Survival does not require privatization. Cuba could utilize socialist alternatives like state-to-state development agreements and targeted foreign investment subject to strict planning conditions. A serious Marxist analysis requires identifying these concessions honestly as a retreat into capitalist relations. It requires establishing enforceable limits to contain and reverse them. Expanding production is no ideological cure-all. Surrendering the commanding heights to private capital shifts the state toward a negotiated capitalist framework rather than a path toward socialist development.